The woman known as Genshō was born in 683, the daughter of Prince Kusakabe and Empress Genmei, though her mother did not yet rule when Genshō was a child. Her lineage was distinguished but tangled. On her father's side, she was a granddaughter of Emperor Tenmu, one of the strongest consolidators of the Yamato imperial line. On her mother's side, she descended from Emperor Tenji, Tenmu's rival and predecessor. This dual inheritance placed her near the apex of courtly bloodlines, but it also bound her to the delicate tensions that followed the Jinshin War, a succession conflict that had reshaped the structure of Japanese authority less than a generation before her birth. Her father, Prince Kusakabe, was the clear heir under Emperor Tenmu's plan to stabilize the throne, but he died young in 689, just 6 years after Genshō was born. His death destabilized the line of succession once again, removing the designated bridge between Tenmu and the next ruler. This absence did not create opportunity for Genshō. It created a vacuum, one that others would later fill, not by will, but by necessity. After Kusakabe's death, Empress Jito, Tenmu's widow and Kusakabe's mother, assumed the throne. Her reign lasted until 697, when she abdicated in favor of her grandson, Emperor Mommu, Genshō's brother. But Mommu too would die prematurely in 707, leaving behind only a child, Prince Obito, too young to rule. Faced again with the succession crisis, the court turned to Genshō's mother, Genmei, who reluctantly accepted the throne. It was not a calculated bid for power. It was an act of preservation, an interim solution to protect the imperial line while the next emperor matured. Genshō grew up under this pattern of reluctant female rule, surrounded by women who had taken power not by seizing it, but by preventing its collapse. Within the palace, she was raised under the layered ceremonial order of the Asuka and early Nara courts. Her education was shaped by Buddhist influence, Chinese political models, and the growing bureaucratic structure of the imperial government. She observed closely, but the role she was expected to play remained undefined. She was not positioned as heir until circumstances, again, removed all other options. When Genmei took the throne in 707, Genshō entered adulthood in the center of court politics, but still without a path of her own. Her brother's son, Prince Obito, was a child of 6. The Fujiwara clan, led by the powerful minister Fujiwara no Fuhito, held considerable sway and had little interest in placing power in the hands of another woman. But Genmei resisted stepping down immediately in favor of a boy. She ruled for 8 years, long enough to begin grooming Genshō, not for reign, but for stewardship. By 715, Genmei was aging, and Obito was still a child. The ministers, once resistant, now feared a direct break in stability more than they feared a symbolic continuation of female rule. They allowed Genmei to abdicate in favor of her daughter, placing Genshō on the throne as the 44th monarch of Japan. She was the first woman to succeed another woman, and the only empress to ever inherit the position directly from her own mother. But Genshō's rise did not reflect personal ambition. It reflected a system attempting to hold itself together under pressure. Her ascension was an institutional decision, not a dynastic statement. She was viewed as a bridge, again, as someone to preserve the legitimacy of imperial succession until the rightful male heir came of age. In this role, she inherited not just the throne, but the shadow of several figures who were not present. She ruled in the name of a dead father who had never reigned, for a nephew not yet ready, and under the continued influence of court ministers who expected little deviation. Her reign began not in triumph, but in controlled delay. Even the naming of her era, Yoro, reflected this sense of holding time still. Genshō was empress in title, but in the eyes of many around her, she was a placeholder. Yet it is precisely this condition that made her reign possible and later quietly transformative. When Genmei abdicated in 715, the throne passed to Genshō not with celebration, but with hesitation. She was 29 years old, the daughter of an empress, the sister of a deceased emperor, and the aunt of the child who was meant to rule next. Her elevation was framed as a continuation rather than a shift, a measure of stability rather than direction. In the formal language of the court, it was a smooth transition. In practice, it was a careful containment. The court remembered the reigns of Empress Suiko and Empress Jito, women who had ruled during moments of uncertainty and proven capable. But those memories had been dulled by years of male successors. Even Jito, who had governed with firm authority, had justified her power as a means to protect her son's succession. Genshō lacked even that veneer. She had no children, no consort, no claim to being a vessel for another's legacy. Her authority rested solely on the absence of better alternatives, and everyone at court knew it. From the start, her decisions were scrutinized through the lens of who still stood behind her. Fujiwara no Fuhito, now the most powerful minister in the Daijokan, held sway over much of the government's practical machinery. He had already shaped the structure of Genmei's reign and had no intention of loosening his grip under her daughter. Fuhito came from a clan that had mastered the art of proximity to the throne, and his influence did not rely on the ruler's gender. But a woman on the throne gave him more room to maneuver. He maintained control over key appointments and administrative reforms. His sons, placed in strategic positions, extended the reach of the Fujiwara family into every corridor of the state. Genshō could issue decrees, but few passed without Fujiwara framing, filtering, or redirection. In many ways, she governed in name, while Fuhito governed in structure. Yet even under such constraints, Genshō understood the importance of appearances. She maintained the ceremonial rhythms of the court with precision, reinforcing continuity with past emperors while quietly shaping a tone of calm authority. She did not challenge the ministers outright, but neither did she withdraw. Her presence became an assertion in itself, a reminder that the state had not faltered under her rule. Still, within the ranks of the bureaucracy, many remembered her as a child behind curtains, the quiet daughter of Genmei, educated but untested. Some of the older officials treated her with courtesy that masked doubt, while younger bureaucrats, raised under the increasing formalism of the Ritsuryo system, viewed her as a transitional figure. She was empress, but not entirely sovereign. Her reign functioned as a bridge, and bridges were expected to hold still. The early years of her rule were marked not by grand initiatives, but by reinforcement of order. Tax collection systems were preserved and adjusted according to precedent. Provincial administration remained in alignment with the codes previously drafted under Tenmu and Mommu. Legal interpretation was standardized under court supervision. Genshō's name was affixed to edicts and appointments, but the hand that drafted them was often Fujiwara's. To those outside the palace, the empire seemed to function as before. But those within the inner circle recognized that her power was more symbolic than direct. She bore the weight of the chrysanthemum seal without the freedom to shape it. Still, her position allowed for subtle influence. She began fostering networks within the court that operated through personal loyalty rather than family lineage. She encouraged Buddhist patronage in a quiet but deliberate manner, aligning herself with the growing cultural and spiritual current that had helped define her grandfather Tenmu's legacy. She made no declarations of vision, no proclamations of reform. Instead, she created space for governance to continue, for her nephew to grow, and for the idea of a female ruler to become less exceptional. Her restraint was often mistaken for passivity, but passivity does not hold an empire steady during a moment of succession risk. She did not ask for the throne. She accepted it, and in doing so, forced the court to adapt, not to her rule, but to her presence. The empire had given her authority and name. She made that name durable. Prince Kusakabe had died in 689, 26 years before Genshō took the throne, but the court had never fully let him go. His memory was preserved not only in family lineage, but in administrative intent, in the assumptions that underpinned reform, and in the quiet comparisons made during every court deliberation. As the only son of Emperor Tenmu and Empress Jito, he had been raised with the full expectation of succession. His early death, at the age of 28, froze that expectation into myth. He had not governed, had not issued laws, had not led armies, but his unrealized rule became a reference point for everything that followed. Ministers who had once served him as prince now remembered him as the ideal ruler who never disappointed them, because he never had the chance to. His image endured as a symbol of continuity and potential, a convenient standard against which the actions of the living, particularly his daughter, were silently measured. For Genshō, this legacy was both shield and burden. On one hand, being Kusakabe's daughter granted her a thread of legitimacy during a period of dynastic uncertainty. On the other, it placed her in a shadow that could not be engaged. She could not evoke him as political justification. He had never ruled. She could not improve upon his legacy. He had never failed. And she could not contradict his memory. There was nothing concrete to push against. What remained was a myth, unchallengeable and undefined, used by those around her to test the shape of her rule. When she made appointments to the bureaucracy, some whispered about who Kusakabe might have favored. When she authorized the continued codification of law, others murmured that it would have been swifter under his leadership. She was compared not to her predecessors, but to a man who never had to rule. In many ways, she governed beside a ghost. The image of Kusakabe also shaped the trajectory of Genshō's relationship with her half-brother's son, Prince Obito. Born in 701 to Mommu and Fujiwara no Miyako, Obito was both her nephew and her closest political heir. His lineage, too, traced back to Kusakabe through Mommu, which gave his claim a double weight. As a child, Obito remained distant from public affairs, raised within the guarded rituals of the imperial household. He did not speak publicly, did not appear in court with frequency, and rarely interacted with administrative decisions. But from the moment Genshō ascended the throne, the court understood that her reign was temporary, and that Obito was being prepared, not visibly, but methodically, for eventual succession. Genshō did not resist this. She did not attempt to prolong her position or block his path. Instead, she allowed the machinery of succession to form around him in silence, protecting his future authority by never overstepping her present one. Her restraint in this regard was not born of weakness. It was a calculation shaped by what had happened to her father. Kusakabe's early death had shown how easily a carefully groomed heir could be lost. Genshō chose to preserve Obito's chances by ensuring that no faction could accuse her of clinging to power. She kept her authority subdued, her public appearances limited, and her policies aligned with precedent. At the same time, she allowed the boy's education to expand quietly under court scholars, aligning his studies with the legal and cultural expectations of rulership. There was no proclamation of regency. There was no discussion of co-rule. But within the scrolls and ceremonies, a path was being cleared. In court memory, Kusakabe had symbolized rightful succession. Genshō, aware of that memory, positioned herself not as a replacement, but as a safeguard. She did not revive her father's name. She made space for his grandsons. And all the while, her own reign continued beneath the weight of that silence, functional, deliberate, and always compared to a man who had never been tested. Empress Jito had ruled a generation before Genshō, but her presence still hovered over the court, her decisions codified, her image carefully preserved in state memory. Unlike the silent myth of Prince Kusakabe, Jito's reign left behind a visible structure. She had been both widow and ruler, mother and lawgiver, and her tenure had redefined the boundaries of female imperial power. Genshō, raised in the court that Jito had shaped, absorbed those boundaries early. She knew the weight of precedent, and she understood how Jito had wielded legitimacy not through personal charisma, but through legal permanence. Her administrative reforms had solidified the foundations of the Ritsuryo system, Japan's early attempt at a Chinese-style legal state, organizing population registers, tax obligations, and provincial oversight. She had used her position to prepare the way for her son, Kusakabe, and when he died, she claimed power in her own name, holding it firmly until she passed it to her grandson. For Genshō, Jito became a model not of ambition, but of containment, how to rule powerfully without appearing to disrupt the order that made rule acceptable. As Genshō took the throne, the legal and bureaucratic systems Jito had refined remained central to the state. The household registers, which underpinned the taxation and conscription system, required constant maintenance and revision. Genshō did not create new structures. She maintained the ones Jito had built. The land redistribution system, known as the Handen Shuju, continued to depend on accurate census data and regular updates to ensure that arable land was assigned equitably. Though often cited as an ideal rather than a practical reality, the system had symbolic weight, and Genshō sustained its legitimacy by preserving its administrative procedures. These were not grand reforms, but their execution kept the empire stable. In this, she echoed Jito's approach: protect the system, even if it meant remaining quiet. Court marriages also became tools of strategy, just as they had been under Jito. Although Genshō never married herself, she observed how kinship ties were leveraged to maintain court factions and build alliances. Jito had used marriages to bind her allies and secure her son's claim. Genshō, though not directly arranging unions with the same intensity, understood their function. She watched as Fujiwara no Fuhito extended his family's influence through his daughters, marrying one to Mommu, thus producing Prince Obito and integrating the Fujiwara line into imperial succession. Genshō did not resist this development. She did not challenge it publicly. Instead, she allowed it to unfold while carefully ensuring that imperial authority did not fall entirely under the sway of any one clan. Her approval of appointments and management of court ceremonies kept the balance intact, even as the Fujiwara position grew stronger. Her relationship to precedent became its own method of control. By not deviating, she denied critics a foothold. By not asserting novelty, she prevented conflict. Her reign came to resemble Jito's not in its events, but in its structure. Authority was expressed through administration, not spectacle. Control was exercised through consistency, not proclamation. Even as the Euro Code, the legal framework completed under her reign, was finalized, it was seen as the culmination of earlier imperial efforts, not the product of her singular vision. She made no effort to claim authorship, but her approval made it law. Within this continuity, Genshō found protection. By modeling her rule on Jito's precedent, she insulated herself from the charge of overreach. She appeared cautious, but behind that appearance was discipline. Her decisions were rarely dramatic, but they were rarely reversed. She was not remembered for the creation of new doctrine, but for ensuring that existing systems did not break. And in this, she mirrored Jito, not in personality, but in effect. She did not need to assert herself as an innovator. She only needed to hold the line steady, so that the future she did not yet name could arrive with certainty. Prince Obito was only 14 years old when Genshō took the throne, too young by court standards to govern, but old enough to observe. As the son of the late Emperor Mommu and Fujiwara no Miyako, he carried a weight of expectation that had been forming since childhood. His claim to the throne was not in question. He was the direct male heir in a system that had always leaned toward male succession, even when exceptions were made. But the path between lineage and rulership was long, and the court had learned from recent history how fragile that path could be. Genshō, who had inherited the throne, not through desire but through necessity, understood this better than anyone. She did not compete with Obito's future. She cleared space for it. Her reign became a quiet form of regency, though it was never called that. Officially, she ruled as the reigning sovereign, but her every action suggested that she saw herself as a steward rather than a founder. She avoided major structural changes, deferred to precedent, and kept the ceremonial traditions intact, knowing that to claim permanence would risk making her reign seem unnatural. In a political world that accepted women in power only as bridges, not as architects, Genshō leaned into the temporary nature of her rule. She did not seek to extend her authority beyond what was needed to protect the throne for Obito, and in doing so, she avoided the backlash that might have followed a more assertive leadership. The court never needed to force her out, because she never gave the appearance of wanting to stay. At the same time, Genshō ensured that Obito was prepared. His education was carefully managed under the supervision of court scholars, with an emphasis on the Chinese classics, legal codes, and Buddhist doctrine. These were not merely lessons in literacy or faith, they were instruction in how to govern. The Ritsuryo state required a ruler who could navigate legal complexity, manage ministers, and maintain spiritual legitimacy. Genshō understood that to preserve the appearance of continuity, Obito would have to embody the full intellectual and moral expectations of the throne. She did not speak publicly of his future, but every detail of his instruction reflected it. She approved appointments to the scholarly ranks that would shape him. She maintained alliances that would protect him, and she withheld reforms that might challenge the shape of the world he would soon inherit. There was no visible mentorship between them. The court did not witness private conferences or shared councils, but Obito watched. He watched the mechanics of governance unfold around him. He watched his aunt navigate the tensions between Fujiwara authority and imperial symbolism. He watched the way she spoke rarely, but always with formality, and he learned the difference between holding power and surviving it. Genshō taught by example, never calling attention to her instruction, never asserting herself as his maker. She gave him a functioning state and the room to grow into it. Her acceptance of impermanence was not resignation. It was strategy. The women before her had ruled under the condition that they would not hold on forever. Suiko, Jito, and Genmei had each given way to male successors, reinforcing the idea that a woman's reign could exist but must end. Genshō did not resist this pattern. She embodied it to avoid being erased by it. By ruling in silence, by yielding to precedent, she carved out space where she could act without drawing condemnation. And by preparing Obito without asserting control over him, she avoided the appearance of rivalry. Her restraint allowed the court to project its expectations onto her without fear. In the end, Genshō's reign was not remembered for resistance or transformation. It was remembered for holding the empire intact, while the boy they all waited for came of age. She gave him more than a throne. She gave him a state that still believed in the process of succession. And when the time came, she did not make him take it. She handed it to him, just as it had once been handed to her. Fujiwara no Fuhito died in 720, 5 years into Genshō's reign. His death removed one of the most dominant figures of her early rule, but it did not weaken the power of the Fujiwara clan. If anything, it widened the path for his sons, who inherited not only titles and appointments, but the institutional habits their father had refined. Fuhito had mastered the role of imperial gatekeeper. He advised, approved, and enforced on behalf of rulers who rarely contradicted him. His sons understood that access was influence, and that proximity to succession mattered more than open rule. They had watched their father shape Genmei's court, and then Genshō's. Now they intended to maintain that structure without interruption. Among them, Fujiwara no Muchimaru emerged as the most prominent. Holding high positions within the Daijokan, he extended the family's bureaucratic control without overt challenge to imperial authority. He and his brothers, Umakai, Fusasaki, and Maro, divided influence across ministries, anchoring the Fujiwara name in the daily operations of the state. Their presence was not a coup, but a saturation. Decisions made in council often bore the marks of their recommendation. Genshō, who had seen how unchecked ambition could destabilize a court, chose not to oppose them directly. She understood that a confrontation with the Fujiwara might fracture the very unity she had been placed on the throne to preserve. Instead, she watched, adjusted, and made space. Her method was subtle. She did not obstruct appointments, but she slowed approvals when needed. She did not reject proposals outright, but she framed her support in ways that clarified her role. Even in ceremonies, Where Fujiwara influence was visible, Genshō maintained the rhythm of imperial authority. She presided with discipline, reinforcing the idea that the throne, though shaped by ministers, was still the source of law and legitimacy. The Fujiwara sons may have maneuvered through court politics, but they did so beneath her seal. That distinction mattered. Genshō's relationship with the Fujiwara was not marked by submission, but by calibration. She allowed their dominance in administration because it offered her stability. Their rise made her own authority seem less threatening to other factions, which in turn reduced resistance to her continued presence. The Fujiwara were too invested in their growing legacy to demand her immediate removal, and Genshō, by not pushing against them, positioned herself as a useful figurehead, reliable, non-interfering, and protective of the institutions that kept the bureaucracy functioning. But beneath that appearance was calculation. Her concessions were never total. She retained final authority over imperial rituals. She approved legal enactments personally. She continued to manage access to the child emperor-in-waiting, Obito, whose legitimacy was a shared interest. There was no moment in which Genshō publicly challenged the Fujiwara. There was no decree in which she curtailed their power, but over time it became clear that she had not been overtaken. She remained, not in dominance, but in presence, not directing every decision, but never removed from the core of them. The ministers did not bow with words, but their policies passed through her hands. Their ambitions expanded, but never at the cost of her erasure. She gave them the room they needed, while keeping the throne steady for the succession she had always known would come. In the shadows of stronger voices, she continued forward, not overruled, but unshaken. Between 715 and 724, the imperial seal bore Genshō's name, even if her voice rarely echoed through the court. Her reign was not one of declarations or visible campaigns. It was conducted through scrolls, through signatures, through the slow weight of institutional continuity. Each year brought new adjustments to the machinery of state, revisions to tax enforcement, clarifications on land allotments, appointments to provincial offices, and each of these decisions moved under her authority. Though many of the proposals originated with ministers, and much of the language bore the tone of the Fujiwara, the seal of approval was hers. It was through this formal and deliberate process that the empire's administrative body evolved without fracture. The most enduring achievement of her reign came with the completion of the Yoro Ritsuryo, a legal code that unified penal and administrative regulations into a single, interpretable structure. The Ritsuryo system, inspired by Tang China's governance model, had begun development under Tenmu and gained momentum under Mommu. Under Genshō, it reached a level of formalization that allowed for broader implementation. The code was not revolutionary in tone. It refined rather than reinvented. But that refinement was critical. It established rules for household registration, clarified expectations for local governors, and reinforced the principle that land and population were to be measured, recorded, and taxed according to central policy. These were not abstract ideas. They were the foundation upon which the fiscal and military structure of the state depended. With these laws in place, emperors after her could rule with fewer improvisations and with greater control. Beyond legal matters, Genshō presided over the continued development of imperial infrastructure. roads connecting provincial centers to the capital were expanded and maintained, enabling faster communication and more consistent tax delivery. Post stations were monitored more closely, and their roles formalized within the administrative network. This attention to logistics was quiet but essential. The Ritsuryo system could not operate in theory alone. It required physical connectivity across an increasingly complex state. Under her reign, the balance between court ritual and provincial oversight grew stronger. Governors were reminded of their obligations. Reports from local officials increased in regularity. Enforcement became a matter of bureaucracy rather than threat. This was the nature of her power, diffuse, procedural, but everywhere. Her name did not dominate poems or monuments. It appeared instead in prefaces, endorsements, and legal formulas. Imperial rescripts began with her authority, even if the content was drafted elsewhere. She became a constant presence in the language of rule without becoming its face. For those who lived and governed in the provinces, the reign of Genshō marked a period of increasing clarity. Laws were codified, expectations stabilized, and appointments followed recognized patterns. While no dramatic reforms reshaped the court, the very fact that the system functioned was an achievement in itself. It allowed the fragile equilibrium between court nobility and local administration to hold. The court chroniclers did not linger on these details. Later histories recorded her reign as brief, orderly, transitional. But in the documents that governed daily life, the regulations on field ownership, the obligations of laborers, the protocols for official conduct, her authority was recorded with precision. Her rulership was not asserted through spectacle or charisma, but through the legal permanence of scrolls that outlived her. She did not ask to be remembered for the code, but it carried her name forward anyway. Her work became the invisible skeleton of the state, one that would bear the weight of her successors long after her seal faded. Genshō ruled for nearly a decade, and during that time she remained unmarried and without children. In a court obsessed with lineage, this fact lingered unspoken, but never unnoticed. The political structures of the Nara-period had come to rely heavily on ties of blood and marriage, paths through which influence flowed, alliances were secured, and succession was justified. An unmarried empress disrupted that flow. She produced no heirs to advance, no sons to shield, and no consort through whom a powerful clan might extend its reach. Her silence on the matter became part of her reign's architecture. No announcement was made, no explanation given. She simply remained alone, and the court adjusted itself around that absence. There were whispers, of course, questions that circulated beneath the formality of court life. Was she forbidden to marry, or had she chosen not to? Had she been kept childless to prevent the formation of a rival lineage? No record answers these questions directly. The historical documents make no reference to lovers, engagements, or proposed alliances. What remains is the fact itself. She bore no child, and the throne passed not to her offspring, but to a nephew, Prince Obito. In a political system where even the most private relationships could become instruments of power, her personal life remained closed. That boundary, while protective in one sense, also left her exposed in another. Without descendants to guard or extend her legacy, she became easier to forget and easier to redefine. Her childlessness also had institutional implications. In the absence of a direct successor, Her reign was understood from the beginning as temporary. It reinforced the idea that her role was not to create a new branch of rule, but to protect the continuity of the existing one. The ministers around her treated her authority as contingent, grounded not in expansion, but in preservation. She was entrusted with power only because she was not seen as likely to claim it permanently, and she confirmed that perception through her conduct. She never sought to name a successor of her choosing, nor did she attempt to shift the court's attention away from the young prince they had long prepared. Her decisions always reflected an implicit awareness that her tenure was to end. But that clarity did not protect her legacy. In the years that followed her abdication, her name appeared in fewer chronicles, her reign summarized in terms of what she had maintained rather than what she had done. Without children or a marital alliance to elevate her memory, she became a neutral figure in court histories, less a ruler than a bridge between others. The administrative achievements of her reign were preserved, but the woman herself was allowed to fade. It was easier to remember her as a placeholder than to confront the fact that she had governed competently, if quietly, without leveraging the tools of dynastic power that defined most reigns. This ambiguity made her legacy vulnerable. Later writers, shaped by shifting views on female rule, could recast her as passive, ceremonial, or forgettable. Interpretations made possible because no direct heir remained to challenge them. Yet the silence around her personal life may also have been strategic. By leaving no descendants, she closed the door to competing claims. By not marrying, she avoided entangling her rule in the ambitions of any clan beyond the one she served. In protecting the legitimacy of the succession that followed her, she ensured that no branch of her own could be used to fracture the line she had preserved. Her absence from the genealogical web that defined much of court politics was not just a void, it was a defense, and it left behind a reign that, while often overlooked, had done exactly what it was meant to do: survive, preserve, and give way. In 724, after nearly a decade on the throne, Empress Genshō abdicated in favor of her nephew, Prince Obito. There was no crisis surrounding the handover, no coup, no pressure, no sudden illness. The transition unfolded with the same restrained discipline that had marked her entire reign. The court, long anticipating the day, received it with a mix of relief and silent uncertainty. Obito, now 23 years old, was of ruling age and had been groomed carefully under her watch. His succession was expected, uncontested, and administratively clean. But the smoothness of the moment did not disguise its weight. By stepping down on her own terms, without disgrace, without resistance, and without vanishing, Genshō did something rare for any ruler, but almost unthinkable for a woman. She walked away from imperial power, with her name still intact. The abdication itself was carefully timed. It followed the full implementation of the Euro Code, a legislative project that had matured under her reign. Her departure came at the crest of administrative stability, allowing her to hand over a functional system rather than a fractured one. There was no public farewell, no recorded statement of emotion or reflection. She did not explain her decision because she did not need to. Her role had always been understood as temporary, a holding of space until Obito came of age. She honored that expectation, but in doing so, she demonstrated a form of authority that extended beyond policy or ceremony. She had ruled. She had chosen when to stop, and the institution had endured. For the court, her departure triggered quiet reorientation. Some ministers welcomed the change openly, eager to reassert themselves under a male emperor. Others, particularly among the younger ranks, who had only ever known Genshō as sovereign, found themselves unsure how to speak of her in retrospect. She was no longer empress, but she had not been removed or replaced. She had not been defeated or diminished. Her survival in memory posed a kind of discomfort. The system that had always treated female rule as conditional had no protocol for a woman who fulfilled the role without collapse. Her abdication had been expected, but her composure in executing it was not. She retired to a quieter court residence, retaining the honorary title of Empress Dowager. In this position, she remained out of the center of governance, but within the orbit of legitimacy. She continued to participate in certain ceremonial functions and maintained influence behind the scenes, though never as an obstacle. Her presence reminded the court of what it had allowed and what it preferred to forget. Future chroniclers would mention her only sparingly. Later historians would simplify her reign as an interlude. But in the eyes of those who had served her, her departure unsettled assumptions. She had governed without disaster. She had upheld law without demanding legacy. And in giving power to Obito, she had not fractured the court, but shown that its foundations did not collapse under female rule. The smoothness of the succession was not a sign of her weakness, but of her control. Genshō had never asked the court to accept her as permanent. She had only asked it to hold, and it had. In a political culture where most rulers either died in office or were forced from it, she orchestrated her own end with the same deliberation that had defined her rule. And in stepping down, she left behind more than a throne. She left a contradiction, a woman who had ruled alone, who had preserved the system, and who had left of her own will. The court moved forward, but behind its restored pattern of male succession, the image of her reign remained steady, quiet, and unresolved. Empress Genshō died in 748, 24 years after she left the throne. There was no national mourning beyond what the court prescribed. No shrines were raised in her name. Her memory was not woven into the poetry that celebrated imperial greatness or divine lineage. Unlike rulers whose deaths were followed by transformation myths or spiritual reverence, Genshō passed into historical silence. Her name persisted, but only in ledgers, in scrolls, in records of legal enactments, and bureaucratic consistency. She was not forgotten entirely. She was indexed, filed. Her life was reduced to reign years, titles, and seals. But within those documents was the architecture of a state that had survived a fragile moment without rupture. She did not leave behind verses. She left behind a functioning empire. The years she held power were quiet, but their influence did not disappear. The Euro Code, completed during her rule, would serve as the legal backbone of the early Nara-period. Though later revised and debated, it became the foundation for administrative continuity under her successor. Her reign marked the normalization of provincial governance under the Ritsuryo framework, expected, enforceable, and traceable. Under her watch, household registries were maintained, tax policies were reinforced, and provincial governors operated with clear lines of responsibility. These were not dramatic reforms. They were systems upheld, preserved through silence. And they made it possible for Shōmu's reign to begin from a position of institutional stability. The succession she managed proved durable. When she abdicated in favor of Prince Obito, who became Emperor Shomu, she ensured that there was no contest, no ambiguity, no rival claim. The empire moved from one sovereign to another without the bloodshed that had marked earlier transitions. Shomu's rule would become one of the most culturally significant of the era, remembered for its deep investment in Buddhism, monumental architecture, and the daibutsu at Todaiji. But that cultural flowering required political ground to grow from, and Genshō had cleared and stabilized that ground. She did not dictate Shomu's vision, but she handed him a state capable of bearing its weight. Her rule was not remembered as a catalyst, but it was the scaffold on which new expression could take shape. The legacy of female rulership in Japan would not disappear after Genshō, but her reign helped solidify a dangerous precedent that a woman could govern competently as long as she stepped aside when expected. In her silence, she confirmed the boundaries the court had drawn. Female reigns were possible, but conditional, tolerated when succession was unclear, and discarded when male heirs matured. She did not challenge that structure, but she did inhabit it fully, and in doing so, she expanded its reality even as she confirmed its limits. Future empresses would rise again, but always under the shadow of this negotiated impermanence. Genshō made space for female rule to exist in practice, even as it remained constrained in theory. Her disappearance from cultural memory was not accidental. The structures of historical writing in the Nara-period were dominated by men who defined political value through conquest, charisma, and legacy. Genshō offered none of those markers. Her power was not loud, but systematic, not emotional, but procedural. She did not seek reverence. She ensured functionality, and that kind of power left fewer traces. It lived in the regularity of reports, in the continued use of forms, in the unbroken chain of imperial legitimacy. She did not collapse, and she did not conquer. She endured, then departed. Her legacy was not marked by transformation, but by absence of failure. In later generations, her reign would be remembered less for what it changed than for what it preserved. The continuity she held became invisible to those who inherited it, as stability often does. But within the machinery of law and court governance, her touch remained. The ministers who once ruled alongside her aged and passed. New ideologies took hold. Buddhism rose to imperial prominence under Shomu. The court's architectural and spiritual landscapes shifted. But the legal and bureaucratic paths that made those shifts possible had been shaped under Genshō's watch. She died quietly, with no heirs to memorialize her, no monumental patronage to carry her name forward in stone or bronze. But the throne she held did not falter. The empire she governed did not fracture. Her power did not need to echo. It only needed to hold. And it did. In the scrolls that structured daily rule, her name remained stamped into the margins. She had ruled, stepped down, and lived beyond her reign, proving what few in her time wished to admit, that a woman could wield authority without calamity, and then leave without loss. She did not ask to be remembered. She asked only for the empire to remain intact, and it did. But in that silence, a question endures. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow?